Last but certainly not least, the panel regarding the interdependence, I would call it, between state aid rules and energy transition, with a remarkable lineup of speakers. It would be somehow strange if there were a state aid panel. I wouldn't like to moderate that. So I will immediately give the floor to Mr. Jan Papsch, who is the deputy head of unit at the European Commission, responsible for energy and environment and state aid granted for that. So I very much welcome you and formulate our gratitude for you having the time to participate in our scientific conference. Sie haben das Wort, Herr Papsch.
Vielen Dank, many thanks, and good afternoon. I hope you can see my slides. Yes, there they are, perfect. So indeed, this is about the Clean Industrial Deal Stated Framework, which was adopted this summer, so in June. It's a completely new framework, which is now seeing the first application. So you have the first decisions which are being adopted, and we expect a lot more decisions to be adopted early next year. The framework was for a while in the making. It was already announced in the mission letter to Executive Vice President Rivera, and it has a clear purpose, which is combining, reuniting the industrial objectives that the Commission pursues under the Clean Industrial Deal, the decarbonization objectives which we pursue, and the simplification agenda, which of course the Commission as a whole is also pursuing. And state aid is often, state aid control, criticized as being too slow, too cumbersome, too burdensome. And of course, we try our best to make it as efficient and as smooth as possible, while still respecting the legal obligations under the treaty to ensure a level playing field and ensuring legally stable and defendable decisions. State aid is a tool. We can contribute to the objectives of the Clean Industrial Deal. We cannot solve all the problems. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There are European funds, there are regulatory measures, but in all of this puzzle, state aid can play a role, and that's why we adopted the CISAF. This also moves on from the temporary crisis frameworks, which we had previously, the temporary crisis framework and the temporary crisis and transition framework. The latter has ended now. It's no longer applicable. And if measures were planned on that basis, they now need to be notified either on the basis of the long-term guidelines, the CEAG, or on the basis of the CISAF framework. There was a public consultation. We have received more than 500 replies from more than 500 stakeholders. Of course, this provided lots of valuable input for our framework. The framework is supposed to provide a longer-term stable guidance on Commission application. Of course, as you know, like other guidelines, this is to an extent binding on the Commission. We can deviate from it, but we need to specifically justify why we deviate from it. So the legal barrier for adopting decisions which are not implementing these requirements is quite high. So this is a good guidance on what you can expect from the Commission. It's supposed to apply until the end of 2030. The legal basis is a normal one. It's no longer a crisis legal basis 173B of the treaty like the TCTF partly had. Now this is just a standard legal basis supporting economic activity. It's still applicable in parallel to other existing frameworks, in particular the climate, energy, and environmental aid guidelines and the regional aid guidelines, also others for transport, for instance. But it does provide a significant simplification, which means that for some chapters of those guidelines, now most measures are being assessed on the basis of the CISAF. What are the different chapters? You see them shortly listed below. It's accelerating the rollout of clean energy, clean, no longer green. So that's not only renewable, there's also other clean fuels in there. Supporting industrial decarbonization, the temporary support of energy costs. That's an absolutely new thing. We had 2.5 TCTF as a temporary crisis measure, but we never had a longer term framework which allowed for energy price support. Support for clean tech manufacturing. We have some demand side measures, tax support for purchasing of clean technologies, and we have a de-risking tool. If you're looking at the first two, one important element is that it's based on the use of schemes. So there's one limit in a way in this the simplification, ad hoc specific measures with individual beneficiaries normally don't fall under this framework. They stay relatively challenging sometimes to adopt. We incentivize the use of schemes. This makes it easier for us. This also makes it easier for the member state, and it is a lot fairer for beneficiaries because we then don't need to discuss why this specific beneficiary was selected and not another one. One idea that was maintained from the temporary crisis and transition framework is to have strict project implementation deadlines. The idea is still to accelerate the rollout of renewable energies, to have more renewables and more clean energy sources in order to also have cheaper generation of electricity and other energy carriers, and to decarbonize faster. But we have added some flexibility there if technologies don't allow for such a fast rollout. I mean, think about hydropower plants. This, of course, takes more time than a windmill does. Then there are justified possibilities to deviate from those timelines. There's also now so-called safe harbors for flexibility and capacity mechanisms. That means there's an annex which provides for requirements. If you meet those requirements, then we can tick the boxes relatively quickly and relatively quickly achieve an approval decision. If you don't tick all of those boxes, then at least the ones which are ticked can be discussed relatively easily. Otherwise, the rest must then be assessed under the climate, environmental, and energy and environmental aid guidelines, the CEAC. For instance, the requirement is to use the European Generation Adequacy Assessment as a basis. If national assessments are used, then we are back under the CEAC for this point at least and need to discuss it. But that's not excluded to nonetheless help accelerating the process somewhat if you manage to tick the other boxes. There's support for industrial decarbonization, of course, like we had in TCTF, but we have now more flexibility in designing the measures. And we include so-called safe harbor elements, which means if you tick those boxes, if you meet those requirements, then the approval is guaranteed in a way. If you don't meet them, there are more general terminologies which allow for more detailed commission assessment, but which can also require a more detailed commission assessment and therefore make the process a bit more cumbersome. There's also some more limited use of natural gas, which is still possible under decarbonization measures. Completely new, in a way, in the long-term framework is the temporary price support for energy-intensive industries. There's a clear list for eligibilities. This is the existing Annex 1 of the CEAC guidelines that was for reductions in charges and levies. And this Annex 1 looks at the electro intensity, but it also looks in particular at the trade intensity. So to what extent a sector is exposed to international competition. Undertakings from this annex are eligible if a member state wishes to implement such a scheme. Member states may also reduce this list if they want to have only a subset of those sectors eligible, but they need to justify this reduction. So they cannot just pick their favorite sectors. There needs to be a non-discriminatory approach to that. One important point is that this is non-cumulative with other aid, in particular with aid under the ETS guidelines. So assuming a member state has a scheme under the ETS guidelines and has maxed out the possibilities there, this is in particular interesting for those who are not eligible under the ETS guidelines, because normally those allow for larger aid payments. So this is not the biggest, but the, say, second biggest companies in the sector, the ones which are subject to international competition, but so far were not eligible for aid under the ETS guidelines. For proportionality, you have a number of requirements, which can be summed up as 4 times 50. You can give support for up to 50% of the wholesale price. This is a big difference from the approach under 2.5 TCTF. We are no longer requiring member states to look at individual energy prices for individual companies. So it doesn't matter at which price you are buying the market, your support is based on the wholesale price. The advantage of this is that there are still strong incentives for beneficiaries to maximize their purchasing price and to buy from the cheapest suppliers. This support can only cover 50% of demand. Another advantage, by the way, is administrative facilitation, because you no longer need to look at individual bills of beneficiaries. This is applicable for 50% of demand. So in quantity, you can only support half the consumption. And you may not reduce the wholesale price below a level of 50 euro. We achieved that after comparing it with international competition. We consider that below 50 euro, there's less of a justification to give this support. 50% of the amount of aid that you receive needs to be reinvested, but there's a lot of flexibility for the beneficiaries how to reinvest it. So the concept is that the beneficiary has to reinvest this for decarbonization and reducing the cost of the electricity system, but that this reinvestment occurs in a way that also helps the beneficiary, either by making a return on that investment or by reducing the costs in their main activity, so that they know the best and the most efficient way how they can use this reinvestment in the eligible investments that are given. Member states may also provide for other investments if they can show that the investments eligible would reduce the cost of the electricity system. There's a bonus. You can get a higher aid intensity if you use the money for demand flexibility. So if at least 80% of this investment obligation goes to investments for demand flexibility, for instance, allowing you to react more quickly to price signals and being able to shift your demand more quickly, then you can get a somewhat higher aid amount. The total measure is supposed to be a transitory measure, which means the time for getting the support is limited to 3 years. That does not mean that the guideline as such, or the framework, is limited to 3 years. But if a member state starts a measure, then until the end of the measure, you only have 3 years per beneficiary. That's meant to avoid a race between member states to get the measure adopted first. Support for clean tech manufacturing is, of course, very important. We have, in several sectors of the economy, a large dependency on third countries for clean tech. And compared to the TCTF, the scope has been broadened. Now, all of the technologies which are mentioned in the Net Zero Industry Act and their main specific components are eligible. Again, this is for aid schemes, so not for individual cases. If there is aid by a third country, you can also use matching aid. That was already a possibility on TCTF. This is somewhat challenging, of course, to prove because you need to show that there is a link to aid by the third country, but it's a possibility. And in case we enter, again, subsidy races with third country, that is an opening. A very new element is that support for manufacturing is also possible outside assisted areas. That said, there are very different aid intensities allowed. So if you're outside of assisted areas, you have a maximum of 15% aid intensity and 150 million euros. If you're inside the most intensive assisted areas, you're going up to 35% of aid intensity, and I think 350 million euros. So the amount of aid is very different, but this is the first time that we are allowing support for manufacturing outside of assisted areas. There's also a change of approach to facilitate the implementation. The maximum aid amount is per project instead of per company, which means that in particular international companies which are active in several member states can have several times this aid granted for different projects. Finally, there's aid for demand side measures. That's if you have purchasing support for clean tech, that can particularly use accelerated tax depreciation to incentivize beneficiaries to purchase more clean tech equipment for their activities. And there's a de-risking tool which allows member states to set up funds which are then reducing the risks for private investors willing to invest into renewables, energy infrastructure, and the circular economy. The idea is to allow investors who are very risk averse, let's say pension funds, to allow in those to invest in those categories, and then for member states to make the investments sufficiently risk-free. That's already all. I know we are short on time, but if there are any specific questions, I'm of course happy to discuss.
I just wanted to say that we thank you very much. This was a very comprehensive analysis of CISAF from the competent, let's say, lips, as we say here in Greece, from the competent person that is somehow supervising this activities of the European Commission. I would like to ask you if this is of course possible. I fully respect the fact that there is a certain delay, which we're trying to cover up, to stay also for a short concluding remark after we have finalize the presentations of the other speakers. If it's not possible, then I would like to again extend my gratitude for you being here, and I would like to thank you for that.
Many thanks. I'll try to stay online. I can't guarantee. It's still quite a number of presentations, I think. No, still 3 presentations.
Yes.
Yes, I'll try to stay online. I hope it works.
Thank you very much.